I'm okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear us?
Good. Yes, well.
Okay. All right. So we are here today to talk about English, the English language. Is it an international language? Is it a foreign language? Why are we studying English? Why do we speak English? These are all the kind of questions that we're going to ask today in English in our conversation club. So let's get started. First question that I have for today is why, well, why do you speak English? Denise, let's start with you. Why do you speak English?
There is many different reasons. First one, because English language is necessary for my works. For a long time, I'm working often with customers from Great Britain or from United States, so it's impossible to communicate without English. Also, the big amount of professional and science literature are written in English, the most part. So for such cases, English language is very useful and important too. And the last one, when I was young, I was a fond of science fiction, and most of classic science fiction written on English language. So to achieve ability read in original was very interesting for me.
Okay, those are, good points you make there. Necessity being the first one you mentioned, of course, that you're using it because you need it to work. Getting back to working and that sort of professional component, you talk about the material, the professional material that's available, academic material, research material, all different kinds of surveys and useful information is presented in the English language. That's definitely a case. And of course, entertainment. So you're talking about science fiction. You mentioned science fiction, but it's not just science fiction. There are many different genres of entertainment that are, of course, going to be in English. And that's definitely a reason why I guess, a lot of people are inclined to learn English so they understand them in their original, or because, I don't know, maybe it's an incentive to, or it's a result. You're so interested in watching something, you watched it in the original and you learned the language as a result. So there are definitely a lot of interesting points you bring up. Elia, let's ask you, why do you speak English? I saw your little post on Facebook, so maybe you can translate that. Go into that a little bit more.
Yes, I speak English. It's a very interesting story. I started learning English first at school, of course, and I have chosen it between. There were two possibilities: whether to learn English or German. Of course, I have chosen English because at that time I thought that English is more beautiful, more not so hard as German language. But it was not so important for me as subject. But after some time, I wanted to learn Turkish, and I haven't found any possibilities to learn Turkish at that time because there was no internet, and I haven't found a good book for self-learning Turkish language. And then I thought, okay, everyone in the world speak English, so let's start with English, and then I will travel to Turkey and speak English there, and everyone will understand me. So that's why I took the old book. It was I don't know how is it in English. So in Russian it is самоучитель. So it is some book which helps you to learn language yourself without any help.
Teach yourself book. Teach yourself. Teach yourself English. Yes.
Teach yourself book English. It is classical variant because the writer was Bonk. It is widespread and well known in Russia. I think everyone who speak English in Russia. Almost everyone, or for example, of my age, have ever heard about this author. And so I, for 3 months, I was 12 years old, and for 3 months, it was summer. I got through that book and was absolutely happy about that. Then I get acquainted with great teachers and develop my skills.
Okay, that's why you decided to study the language, but I'm asking, why do you speak it today? Why do you speak it today?
Oh, I speak it today because I have learned it a bit. So that's why I speak it today, because I like it. And afterwards, it became a part of my job. Unfortunately, I haven't developed it as much as it could be, or not. I haven't reached that level I would like to yet, but still I speak English a bit.
Okay, well, that's definitely an interesting story, and you make that interesting choice, or mention that interesting choice you had to make, or that common choice you had to make, English or German. I mean, this is definitely something that a lot of people, I guess, have been faced with in Russia. You know, that sort of which language will you choose, and we'll talk more about that later. But you chose English, and you chose that teach yourself English book, and you seem to have done a very good job, you know, and it's taken you, well, taken your life in the path that it has. Why do I speak English? I speak English because I was born in the United States, because English is spoken there, and because it is my native tongue. So it's a bit of a different situation. However, working with people who have been learning English, or working with people who are learning English for how many years now? 15 years now. It is clear to me that there are many different reasons why people speak English, why people study English, why people want to know English. And there's also, while there is enthusiasm for the language, there is also a certain degree of, I would say, backlash against the language. Maybe it's because of the necessity, as Denise mentioned. Maybe it's, I don't know, we'll talk more about this later, but it's an interesting thing to discuss. And this gets me to the next question, which definitely gets back to what Denise was originally mentioning. Elia, let's ask you first. Do you feel that knowing English is a necessity? Is it a necessity?
I'm absolutely sure that it is not a necessity, and I think that it became an international language, although I have, yes, posted that in Facebook, and I even got comments, and one of that comments was that English is not an international language, but it is a language of international communication. So there is a bit difference, but still I think that every modern person should know English, and actually I should say that every modern child even know English. So the situation is so maybe not very high level, or even not the middle level, but still everyone knows English today. At least
Okay. Is that, would you say that's a necessity, or is that just a result, a consequence, a side effect? What would you say?
it's a necessity and a result.
Okay.
It's necessity which becomes a result. I don't know.
All right. And Denise, what about you? Do you think that, well, you mentioned it. Would you say, how much of a necessity would you say that speaking English is?
It's a hard question, because to my mind, learning any language is own choice for each people, for each man. And But in common case, yes, it's very important because knowledge of English provide a big amount of different abilities in work, in accessing to different information, in entertainment, of course. So it's very important, but it's hard to me say estimate it in category of necessity. Because it's possible to live without knowledge of English and without using of English, but for most cases, ability to speak or to read or to listen in English, it's what is the right word? It's an advantage. It's an advantage.
Okay, advantage. Advantage.
Yes,
That's a good word.
advantage.
That's definitely a good word to use, Denise. It's interesting because I just got back from a short trip to the U.S. and while I was there, it's very hard to ignore the fact that in the United States of America, a country where English is quite prevalent, although not the official language of the country, there is no official language of the United States of America. Not everyone who lives in that country speaks English. And that has been the case for many, many years now. And it's interesting that when we mention things about necessity, that we mention things like it's just the effect of being exposed to English in one way or another. How then is it possible for people who live within a country where English is the predominant language to not speak the language? I think these are very interesting things. And it gets us to maybe a bigger debate over what we define as necessity, what our goals are, why we have decided, or why some people have decided that English, for whom it is a foreign language, is such a necessity, whereas people who have direct access to that language to potentially learn it as a native language or use it as a native language have chosen not to. So again, I think this is an interesting thing to look at. So is it a necessity? Is it a choice? Is it a goal in life? Is it the result of us setting certain expectations for ourselves and maybe putting into our plan the notion that, yes, knowing English, knowledge of English is something that's important for our standing professionally? I don't know. I think it's a very interesting thing to say. Personally, all right, I am speaking as someone who is a native speaker of English, but also as someone who has worked in a language that has not been English. I don't think that knowing English is for people that don't have it as a native language. I don't think it is a necessity per se, but as you were saying, it is an advantage in certain spheres. Although in other spheres, we can say that perhaps not knowing English, I'm thinking of maybe an academic researcher, for example. The academic researcher who is trying very, very hard to speak English, to do his work in English, to be a part of this international academic community, is perhaps not fully expressing himself in his native language as a result. And perhaps the researcher who is working exclusively in his native language and is then translated into English by someone else, perhaps is at a bigger advantage because he has the advantage of his native language that is his working language. Again, this is, there are a lot of different variables we can add into this equation. So sometimes I see that it's not necessarily the best choice to be using English as the language you're working in. Although for many people, if not most people, if you're not representing yourself in English, you are going to be at a disadvantage. So I think that is definitely a key word to use. It is an advantage to know English in today's world. Moving forward, all right. And Eddie, I'm going to ask you first because you were given the choice, of course, of English or German, and you mentioned that in school. Do you know anyone who categorically refuses to speak or learn English? And I ask you this because I know several people who, when asked the question, well, why don't you speak English or what have you, maybe not even directly asked, but their excuse is always, I learned German in school. And it's interesting because it seems to me that I've met many people like this in Russia, particularly, who just kind of have this aversion to all things English because, quote unquote, they studied German in school. So, Elliot, have you ever met anyone who is just categorically against English? I'm curious.
No, I have never met people who against English. I only met people who refuses speaking English because of um, they are patriotic and they would like to develop their own language. So I came in touch with such situation in France, where many French people who can speak English, they were refusing speaking English because they want you, me, and the others to learn and to know French. And that's why they prefer to speak French. Although I know that they know English and they can speak English.
Okay, the French is definitely a good example for that sort of thing. Denise, what about you? Do you know anyone who categorically refuses to speak or study English?
I don't know anyone who categorically refused to learn to speak English, and to my mind, it's now time. It's impossible to really totally refuse to speak English because in Russian there is many words acquired from English now in technological sphere, in science. But I know some people who don't want to spend any time to learn English or to improve English skills, and it's not important for them.
Okay, I mean, I've definitely encountered people, I think, as you were talking about, Elia, with this sense of patriotism that they just don't wish to do that. I've also noticed a lot of people for whom languages are quite difficult. It is not their strong point. And they kind of use this patriotism as an excuse not to know English or develop other sort of, I don't want to say excuses, but reasons and just reasoning for not knowing a language. But yeah, for the most part, you get people who I think realize how useful English can be for them. And there are other people who really either don't see how useful it can be, don't have the use for, or just don't have the time or desire for it. So again, there are different people who are going to have different levels of enthusiasm for or not, learning a language, in my experience. But, it's kind of the result of just different people and different priorities in life. Let's get to another question. We're talking about English, but I also want to talk a little bit about Russian. And my question is, do you think that Russian is an international language? We talk about English as being this international language of communication. Is Russian such a thing? What do you think, Denise?
Yes, because at first Russian was an widespread international language on ex-USSR territory, because on the Soviet time that was one of the international language for Eastern Bloc. And now it's still an international language for some regional countries. And also it uses, you find a very good article about using Russian language in international communication on Space Station Alpha, on ISS. Because it's...
it is.
Yes. The most big part of some part of station was built in Russia, so there's many Russian language labels, Russian descriptions, Russian manuals, and also part of space flights are controlled by Russian Space Control Center, and historically, most all parts of communication from Russian territory being in Russian language. So probably it's still one of important part, and
Okay.
also it's some regional specific language.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, it's interesting though. You mentioned, and I sent that article about the use of Russian on the International Space Station. Interestingly enough, I just read an article in this Profil magazine, this weekly magazine in Russia, and it basically talks about the state of the Russian space program. And well, judging from this article, it's quite interesting that the language has much clout. But anyway, I would, if you have a chance, I would recommend reading this. It's kind of it's not a particularly positive article, but I think it's one that people should be aware of. I don't know. Have you guys read this by any chance? No? Maybe. All right. But anyway, it's interesting. But in any case,
sorry, can I add a little bit? I remember about one funny case in Prague. I can't remember.
Prague? In Czech Republic.
Czech.
Prague.
Okay. In Prague, there was two situations where we start spoken on English, but then switch on Russian because as I said, of other peoples sometimes prefer Russian and knows Russian well than English. It's more about rather old people, but that was.
Okay.
And I was surprised because some years ago, most of people in Czechoslovakia reject spoken Russian.
Yeah, reject, but regardless, it's still there, right? Maybe it's an easier language to communicate in. So, I mean, it makes sense. It does make sense. But anyway, we're talking about this Russian as an international language or not. Elia, I'd like to hear from you because you, of course, are from Tashkent, right? So tell me about Russian. Is it an international language? What do you think?
No, I can't say that Russian is an international language. Of course, when you've got widespread influence and connection with other countries and even maybe colonies or ex-colonies, and when your language is obligatory in many schools, of course, many people know that language. But first of all, Russian language uses Cyrillic alphabet. That's why I think, and if to compare it with Latin, I think it is not very convenient and not so widespread. And I don't know. The same situation is with the Chinese language. Yes, lots of people speak Chinese, but I think that, and many people think that it is high time to learn not English but Chinese. But I think that Chinese will never be an international language because of that very difficult alphabet, uh, which is a part of that language.
Of course, this system of characters, not an alphabet, but a completely different system for writing, which is definitely not something that the Western world is at all familiar with because our languages are completely different in that respect. I just want to mention here, the correct word is Cyrillic in English.
Cyrillic, okay.
Cyrillic. The C is soft. Like you would say, what are they? Oh my goodness. Saint Cyril. Cyril,
yes.
It's not, so it's a soft C sound. Anyway, but this is very interesting that you mentioned. I don't know. I mean, I think that Russian is definitely a factual international language of communication. Of course, the things that you mentioned, Elia, about the alphabet barriers or what have you. This is very, very real. But I have also experienced, and this is maybe okay regionally. Regionally, yes. but nonetheless very much true. I have seen how older generations of people have been able to communicate with each other in the Russian language when communicating in, say, English was just not possible. And it's quite, I mean, it's definitely part of the history and geopolitical, I guess, like, I don't know, inheritance of the post-Soviet space. But you can't deny the fact that you have, you know, people who went to school, who learned Russian in school, who are using it on a regular or semi-regular basis and can still use it to communicate. Whether or not this continues, I think that it's quite, you know, clear to just about everyone that it's never going to be exactly the same. You, of course, have a growing tendency against this Russian language, with the exception of areas where there is a significant Russian population outside of Russia, where there is a demand and there is a sort of human rights need for those sort of things. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely changing. The world is changing. Elia, you mentioned Chinese as an alternative, but like, as you mentioned, it's a completely different way of writing. And this is not something that is as fascinating as it is to say, hey, I'm going to learn Chinese. You know, it's an extra step. It's an extra 2 steps, I would say, because one, you've got different, well, you've got characters instead of letters, and then you have a different way of formulating things compared to Indo-European languages, which of course for us are native. So yes, very interesting points. So it looks like English is probably our international language of, I don't know, necessity, choice, reality. I don't know what the right way to put it is. What do you think then the international language should be? Denise, what do you think the international language should be, and why?
It should be because it's useful. Because, no, for example, we can look at that situation, possible situation, where there is no some widespread international language, but there is many different local international languages. And in such case, it's a slightly simpler to learn your local language, and it's allow communication to some nearby countries. But if you try to travel far away, it's impossible to communicate. So some really world international language well spread over different countries, it's very useful to economy, to spreading ideas, to communication, and so on. Also, historically, we have a good example with Latin language. Many years ago, it was the most important language for spreading science knowledge, and most information was written on Latin language. And it was very useful to learn one language and get access to that information. The situation today with English language. The most of science texts is written on English. The most part of code in programming also written on English-based languages with English commands.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Loka, have you joined us?
Yep, finally I made it. Hello, everybody.
Hello. All right, we are talking about English. We're talking about languages, about international languages. Let's maybe talk to you, Loka. Let's ask you the question. What do you think the international language should be, and why?
Should be. Well, I can't think about it. I know that international English is language, sorry, is English. So that's it, maybe. And why? Well, international language should not be very difficult, I think. It's the most important like demand.
Okay, so you think that English is not a difficult language?
No, I think it is.
Okay, all right. I think it is a very difficult language, full of rules and exceptions
Yeah,
The
sure. But
exceptions being more prevalent in the situation. But Elliot, let's get to you next. What do you think the international language should be, and why?
I agree with Loka that international language, first of all, should be convenient and easy. And I should say that English is rather easy when you begin just to learn it. Um, it is, how is it called? This easiness is not the true one, and but you will understand it just sometime later. So that's why it becomes not so important, maybe because you have already started learning language and become involved in the process, and very often, fortunately very often, it is very enjoyable process. And I just thought about Spanish, that Spanish is really also very mm, comfortable and convenient language for communicating, but that I think that why English became international and not Spanish, but it is also discussable question, yes, because very many people in the world also speak Spanish, and because these both languages are very I don't know, they're comfortable to learn, I think understandable for everyone in the planet. So they have both equal chances to be widespread all over the world. But I think that Britain and USA influenced in political way a little bit more the whole planet. That's why English is on the top of the list and not Spanish, although lots of people speak Spanish.
Okay, very good point to make. Very good point to make. I actually think that Spanish would be a great international language. I kind of agree with you in that respect, Elia. I think that it's a fairly easy language to learn, and I think that it's more logical than English is. Also, as a native speaker of English, I will tell you quite honestly that I am, I don't know how to say this without offending people, but I think it's a valid point to make. And I think that you as native Russian speakers might understand this too, that when your language becomes an international language, there are rules about the way that the language is supposed to be spoken. But when it is spoken by people who are not native speakers of the language, there is a lot of room for, I don't want to say variation, but for interpretation of the language. So, for example, if you go to a school in the middle of, I don't know, let's give some random city in Russia. Let's say Yekaterinburg, okay? I'm sure that there is some class, you know, like third class, fourth class, fifth class, anyway, some class of students that is learning to pronounce some word in English completely wrong. And I'm sure that the year before them and the year before them, and probably like the entire neighborhood, every child who has gone to this school from this teacher and the teacher before and the teacher before is all pronouncing this word wrong. Why? Because somewhere along the line, the teacher was taught that this is the way that this word is said. And it's been carried down through the years. Now, what you see nowadays, because of, as you were mentioning, Elia, you know, this is the reality of the situation when you have children who are watching movies and television series in the original language, who are, you know, getting the way that the language is actually spoken and have free access to it. They're going to know that this word is not spelled, I don't know, categorically, and or instead it's categorically, all right? And they're going to know that, all right? What happens, and I think this is something that's interesting when you have English as an international language, you have a language that is taught and learned instead of being understood. So I think that English, and I'm trying to be objective about this, I'm not trying to criticize anyone, but I'm trying to say is that when you have a language that is as tricky as English is, and English is a very tricky language. Look at participles in English, All right. And try to find the logic in that, because I, for the life of me, cannot. And I am a teacher of English. And I look at that and all I say to my students is memorize. Get the chart and memorize. Memorize present, memorize past, and memorize participle, because in very few circumstances are you going to just automatically be able to look at the word and think up, you know, this participle on your own. And I think this is something that for me is saying, I don't support English as an international language because there are too many exceptions to rules that need to be learned, and too many, really too much gray area, I think is the word. But that's, again, that's my opinion. I'm all for Spanish. I think that's a good sort of solution, but that's neither here nor there. All right, you guys, let's get to our next question, which is, how would you compare international English to English as a native language? Which is kind of getting into what I was saying. Let's start with you, Ljoka. How would you compare international English to English as a native language?
Well, international English is much easier, I think, and it is more primitive than an English as a native language. So when you speak it as a native speaker, you use it in like in a full volume or full, I don't know, charge, you know how to say it correctly. And international English, due to the fact that most people don't know it very well, it is in the most part of the world, it is very, very primitive. And when you try to talk to them using good English, they don't understand you usually. So you have to make your English easier and more primitive. And so for example, if traveling in Asia, your English, it will damage your English definitely. So that's it.
Oops. Okay. Yeah, good point to make. Denise, what about you? What do you think? How is international English different from English as a native language?
To my mind, it's probably we are in beginning of splitting these languages because traditional English, especially British English, language with a big and complicated history. And I find that it's very simple to understand also in written text is also an English native speaker or not. And to my mind, it's a good way to create probably a simpler and more well-structured international language based on English. So I usually meet, especially for developers or testers from China or from Pakistan or from India using ID with a regular web. It's understandable and it's well structured than exceptions. So probably after half of 100 years, we obtain a true English like a traditional international.
Okay, I want to make a note here, guys. I want everyone to pay attention because I'm giving you a NB, nota bene here. To my mind, is I think the most Russian English, I don't know what to say, like phrase that comes to mind. And I know you all say it, and I am even guilty of saying it because I've heard it so many times. But we wouldn't say "to my mind" in English. We say something more like "in my opinion." So if you guys want to make a note, every time you want to say "to my mind," say "in my opinion." I'm just going to give that out there because it's one of these things that I don't know how many times I've heard, and I just want to, make you guys aware. In my opinion is a much more natural way to say "to my mind," and it means what you want it to say. So Denise, I'm giving that to you, but everyone, because I think I've heard everyone say it. And like I say, I'm guilty of saying it too, because it's very catchy. It's one of those, it sounds good. It sounds good, but it's just not what people say in English. So anyway, just making that note. But yes, what about you, Elio? What do you think? What do you think? How are they different? International English and English as a native language.
I don't know. Maybe mostly I get acquainted with international variant of English. I think so. But native English, I don't know. What is it? Native English? Is it the language which is used in BBC channel? What is it? Native language, native English language, or is it that language?
Yeah, I'm just talking about a language that doesn't have to be studied to be known, but that's something that is naturally acquired.
Yes,
language.
I've okay, I see. I watched just before that meeting the one professor, I don't remember his name. He was speaking about standard English and non-standard English. Okay, something about that, yes? So we've got some standards, but lots of people avoid that standards because they speak English in their own way, and it concerns many aspects: spelling, pronunciation, using phrases. So, and for me, I would like to just to tell some words about that dialects of in England. I mean Scottish variant and things like that. That's I think for me it is much more easier to understand Chinese person speaking English than that very guy from Scotland speaking English.
What if it's a Chinese person speaking Scottish English?
I don't know. I have never met, maybe fortunately.
All right, because I remember I met an Indian person from India speaking Southern American English. You guys know how Southern English, the Southern accent sounds. It can be very difficult to understand. And on top of it being difficult to understand, it was being spoken by someone who's, well, I don't know if this guy's native language was English or if it was, I don't know what it was. But anyway, in any case, it was extremely difficult to understand the way these people were speaking, and yet they were speaking English and I didn't understand a word they were saying. But anyway, it's an interesting point you make, and I think it gets back to this whole kind of notion of why we study English, what our goals are, why we're using it, why we're speaking it. And if you are using it to have communication, to be understood, then of course there's going to be a lot more freedom. You're talking about this primitive language, is that what you put it as? And that's, I think, an interesting way to look at it too. Is it really correct English? Is it not? Again, what are our goals? And if you think that speaking English in the way that you need to speak it is more like a native speaker, it's definitely going to be a different process than for a person who is learning English in order to get by while traveling in a country where English is not the language that's, natively spoken. So there's so many different things to look at in a question like this or in a situation like this. But I think it's interesting that we're talking about it and exploring, our feelings on it. This gets me to our next question, which is, how important do you feel English grammar to be? How important is English grammar? Elia, tell me, how important is it?
Oh, sorry, I was mute. English grammar is the most important point, I think, to be understandable. And it is really interesting and really difficult to learn and to use English grammar properly.
Okay, spoken as a true English teacher. Good job. Loka, what about you? How important do you think grammar is?
I think, actually, it depends on your aims, on what you want to do with the person you talk to. For example, if you just need him to understand you, you can use well, your fingers. Actually, you can make him understand you even without any English. Well, just let's accept it. But so in this case, right grammar is not necessary. Moreover, as I've told before, when you speak correctly good English, for example, I lived in Egypt and in Asia, they didn't understand me when I spoke with all these perfect tenses and all that stuff, and so I had to speak in a very, very simple way and in a wrong way to make them understand me. But if you need to make a good impression on a person, for example, right? If it is a native speaker or just a person with a good English. So in this case, good grammar is really important, and that will as the level of grammar and the level of your English and vocabulary will make the how I say соответствующий the needed
The rest.
impression, the right impression, not the right. That, for example, if your English is bad, it will make bad impression.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. It's just the impression that will make. It will make a good impression or a bad impression depending
Good
on
impression,
how you speak. Right.
depending on the level. Yeah,
Right.
that's it. Mhm.
Okay. And Denise, what about you? What do you think? What do you think? I mean, how
Yes,
important do you think the grammar is?
important, but to me, it's not on first place. I started learning English mostly on reading some technical articles, and amount of what I know, my vocabulary was most important for me. But after I started speaking on English, discussing on English, I feel that my knowledge of English, my ability to use English grammar in speaking is not good, extremely not good, and I feel it's important. But at last time, usually I can to avoid some misunderstanding by context, and but I still have no ability to use grammar in proper way for some cases. But I started to pay attention on grammar when I write some text in emails. So I feel that it's important, but it's a hard for me, the hard point for me.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, all right. I think that grammar is very important. And I'm speaking as a native speaker. I'm speaking as someone who values language, who is a linguist and what have you. But I'm going to honestly say that I think that a lot of people who learn English and who are very serious about learning English for professional reasons, for academic reasons, right, who have very good reasons to study English, oftentimes overthink grammar. And this is something that I'm going to just give a little kind of, I don't know what you would say, like warning. Sometimes, okay, it's absolutely important to study grammar, to have those charts, verb conjugations, to have a list of pronouns, to remember, which you do here. Like I said, that list of participles are very important too. But what's also important is listening and reading and paying attention to what you hear and what you read. And oftentimes what you will find in doing that, and this is if you're listening to quality audio and you're reading quality text, what you will find is, hopefully, all right, like I say, if it's quality material, you will hear and you will read the way that the language is supposed to work, or the way that the language naturally works. I think that's an important thing to say. For example, I think we all know grammatically that we do not end sentences with a preposition in English, right? You don't end a sentence with a preposition, all right? The reality is that in natural English speech, it very often happens. And if you Okay, for example, if you decide to ask the question, which room are you in? You all understand what I'm asking, right? Which room are you in? Of course, that sentence ends in a preposition, which means that it's not grammatically correct, which means there has to be another way to ask it. So I'm going to ask, in which room are you? And I think you all understand what I'm asking there too. And you all realize that grammatically that's correct. But it doesn't sound right in English. In which room are you? Which room are you in? Sounds much more natural. And this is why, I mean, yes, grammar is extremely important, extremely important. The reality is that proper grammar is not something that people always adhere to, and that includes native speakers. And that's why I emphasize very strongly listening to people speak, whether that be in television shows or in real life or, you know, in the workplace or what have you. It's important to hear the natural speech patterns of people. And bear in mind that, yes, there are a lot of grammatical problems, a lot of grammatical errors, a lot of things that I hear people say that I would never say. However, that's how people say it. And it's good to be aware of that. And maybe sometimes, you know, find the sort of exceptions that you're willing to make in order to sound more natural in English. But again, this is something that I think that most Russian speakers of English are extremely guilty of. You guys know grammar far too well. You know English grammar better than native speakers of English know grammar, all right? Partially that's because we don't learn it in school for the most part. I did, but that was only because I studied Latin. And when you study Latin, you kind of have to learn English grammar to go along with it, because you're translating things and it just doesn't make sense if you don't know it otherwise. But again, I think that grammar is very important, but we need to know our boundaries and realize the reality of the situation, which is people don't always use perfect grammar. All right, next question. What is your strategy to learn English? Denise, let's start with you. What is your strategy to learn English?
I have a very stochastic strategy, and probably more correct way to explain, I have no strategy at all. For me, ability to speak English and to understand English, it's more a practical need. So when I started feel something uncomfortable to me, or I feel importance for me, for example, I started feel important that grammar is important to me, and I started to pay attention on it, trying to read some articles, to do some tests. So I prefer natural way to learn English, to find important direction or important points. It's allow me to keep me motivated, well motivated. Because when I studied English at university or school, that was a useless process. I have no motivation. I don't understand why it's important for me, why I should invest time on this process.
Okay, that's fair. What about you, Loka? What is your strategy for learning English?
Well, I neither have any strategy except I do only one thing. I watch series in English, and that helps me a bit. And right now I'm participating in English club, so that's also a little piece in my, they saying strategy of learning English. So, well, actually, I don't do much on this now. I just watch, listen, and I try to read some short articles, maybe if there is something interesting to me.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And what about you, Elia? What is your English learning strategy?
You know, nowadays I think I just try to
Turn the sound off your phone.
Yeah. I try to keep that level which I have, because language, it is something like muscles. You have to train all the time, otherwise you will lose your skills and even ability to maybe not understand but to talk and to remember some words. If you if you don't use language, you will forget the words, and it, it is not very pleasant situation. So, but when I was a student, the strategy was very simple, just that very levels, academic, I think academic levels of learning English, that elementary, pre-intermediate, intermediate, and uh, so on. At the end of university, the level of the students should be advanced or even proficiency, but in my case, it was intermediate, and I stuck on that level because as I said, that language was always something like fun for me. Maybe I haven't seen mm, some very useful things concerning with profession or things like that, although I have studied it at the university. So in my case, first it was academic strategy, and then just participating in English conversation club to keep fit.
Okay, that sounds good. It sounds like a good strategy. I'm all for that. I'm all for that. All right, let's think. Do we have any? I don't know. We don't really have time for any other questions. But you guys, do we have any ideas for our next conversation club? Ideas? Participants?
Sorry, could you repeat your question, Daniela?
Do you have any ideas for our next meeting?
Oh.
No. Okay.
I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Autumn? What about autumn? What to do in autumn? Or to cheer up in dull.
Have we talked about that? Have we talked about that seasonal affective disorder? Did we talk about that last year? Maybe.
Yes, we have talked. What about Denise? What is his idea?
I tried to find a list of topics I copied from one site before, but seems it's
okay. But I'm just thinking, is there anything fresh on anyone's mind? Anything fresh on anyone's mind?
Okay, maybe some topic closely connected with autumn. I don't know, lack of warm love. I don't know, relationship.
I don't know. I don't know what is related.
Autumn in art.
Autumn in art.
We, as I remember, we discussed autumn. I forgot right name. Autumn disease.
Yeah, that was what we were talking. Did you discuss that with us, Denise, or were you not there for that? No. Seasonal affective disorder. Sad.
Yes. Sad.
Okay.
Seasonal affective disorder.
Do you want to discuss that again? I mean.
No. We can discuss, if we look at autumn, we can discuss something, some topic like autumn in art, because autumn is rather a symbolic period of time.
Okay. All right. Well, let's think then. You guys want to discuss autumn? Yes? No?
Yes, okay, why not?
All right. Why not? Yeah, it sounds good.
It's hard to find any fresh topics because The previous
No,
was
it's
not very teeny. It was rather
true.
white.
All right, you guys. Well, that sounds good. And then we will plan to meet next week, same place, same time.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you
Sorry
very much.
for
Thank you,
All right.
Daniela.
Always
late
great
coming.
to.
Thank
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being a participant. It's very interesting indeed. All right, you
Thank you.
guys. See you next time. All
See
right.
you. Bye bye.
Goodbye.
you. Bye.